This latest phase of the crisis did not begin with an airstrike. It did not begin with a barrage of missiles. It began with what appeared, at least on the surface, to be a cooling move from Washington. President Donald Trump announced a pause in plans for a strike on Iran following a mediation proposal from Pakistan. For a brief moment, that suggested the confrontation might be stepping back from the edge. But within hours, events on the ground pointed in the opposite direction. Iran moved quickly to seize 2 vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. That waterway is one of the most important energy transit corridors in the world. The timing did not look accidental, and the message was difficult to miss. Even without an American strike, Tehran showed that it could still exert pressure at one of the global economy's most sensitive choke points. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping lane. It is a strategic valve in the world energy system, a route through which roughly 1/5 of global oil and liquefied natural gas supplies pass. In that environment, it does not take a full-scale war to trigger global consequences. A ship seizure, a warning shot, or even a brief disruption can move energy prices and unsettle financial markets. Iran understands that leverage very well, but the larger picture is more complicated than the image Tehran is trying to project. While Iran has escalated at sea, the United States has not withdrawn from the contest. Trump's decision to pause a strike did not mean Washington had eased pressure. American naval forces have continued what the transcript describes as a maritime blockade targeting Iranian commerce. Tehran treats that pressure as an act of war. The result is a dangerous paradox. The United States has not launched a direct attack, yet it is still tightening the screws. Iran has not been struck, yet it is reacting as if it is already being cornered. That is the space in which this confrontation is evolving. It is no longer centered only on direct threats or public ultimatums. It is becoming a strategic contest in which even limited moves carry broader calculations. Iran is using Hormuz to demonstrate control. The United States is maintaining maritime pressure to preserve long-term leverage. These are 2 very different approaches, but they are now colliding on the same board. A central question follows from that. The issue is not simply how many ships Iran has seized or how many warning rounds have been fired. The deeper question is who is controlling the tempo, who is shaping the rules, and who is forcing the other side to react. Iran can make the strait volatile. It can inject urgency into the situation and capture global attention. But controlling a choke point is not the same thing as controlling the wider conflict. That distinction becomes clearer when looking at how both sides are behaving. After the action in Hormuz, the region did not calm down. If anything, the atmosphere thickened with mistrust and calculation. Iran did not stop at detaining ships. It also issued firm warnings that any disruption to order in Hormuz should be treated as a red line. That was more than a maritime security statement. It was an attempt to place itself in the position of rulemaker along a route that formally belongs to the international community. This is where the strategic contrast begins to sharpen. Tehran appears to be trying to turn Hormuz into a power switch, something it can tighten or loosen in order to pressure the outside world. That approach can generate immediate attention, but it also carries major risks. Each time Iran raises the temperature in the strait, it is not only sending a message to Washington, it is also putting Europe, Asia, and every economy dependent on stable energy flows on alert. In effect, Iran risks defining itself as a source of instability that others will increasingly organize to contain. Washington's response, by contrast, looks quieter but more deliberate. Trump's pause in military action was not matched by any visible rollback in the pressure campaign. There has been no clear sign of a softer maritime posture, no obvious easing of economic pressure, and no indication that Washington has accepted Iranian terms. That creates a very specific kind of stalemate. The United States keeps its pressure architecture intact without immediately escalating into direct war, and in that sense, restraint becomes a form of leverage rather than a sign of retreat. For Iran, that is a difficult scenario when there is no clear new American concession and no single fresh military blow to answer. Tehran has to create its own visible actions in order to preserve an image of resolve. The vessel seizures in Hormuz may therefore be important symbolically, even if they do not fundamentally alter the deeper balance. At a broader level, this is a contest between two models of conflict. Iran relies on sudden shocks, geography, and tactical surprise to produce immediate effects. The United States relies more on systemic power, on controlling trade flows, sustaining pressure, and widening the field of competition beyond the immediate hotspot. One side tries to shake the board, the other tries to control the entire board. That is why Iran may be able to make Hormuz more dangerous by the hour, yet still struggle to force a change in American strategy. In fact, each new Iranian escalation can reinforce Washington's argument that containment measures should remain in place or even expand. The effect is cumulative. What looks like initiative in the short term can become justification for tighter control in the longer term, and this is where the story begins to move beyond the strait itself. The confrontation is no longer confined to a narrow geographic corridor. As Iran focuses on a strategic choke point, the United States appears to be shifting toward a different layer of advantage altogether. That layer is built less on geography than on technology, data, and control over the battle space of modern war. According to the transcript, Washington has begun deploying advanced counter-UAV systems in the Middle East, especially at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. That base has previously faced repeated threats from Iranian drones and missiles. This is not a random adjustment. It suggests that American planners have absorbed a central lesson of recent conflicts. Modern warfare is not always determined by the most expensive weapons. It is increasingly shaped by the ability to defeat cheaper, more flexible, and more numerous threats. What makes this especially notable is that some of the technology now being used was not originally developed by the United States. The reporting refers to a platform called SkyMap, developed and refined by Ukraine during its war with Russia. If that description is accurate, it points to a significant shift in how Washington is thinking. The United States is showing that it is willing to learn from another battlefield. In Ukraine, low-cost drones became a defining feature of the conflict. Integrating lessons from that environment into the Middle East means Washington is not treating theaters of war as isolated anymore. It is trying to connect them. It is taking methods proven under one set of pressures and applying them to another. That matters because it changes the logic of defense from isolated systems to integrated networks. The model described in the transcript is built around real-time coordination. Radar feeds, sensors, and multiple platforms are pooled into a single command structure that can detect, track, and engage incoming threats in that network. Systems such as FAAD provide tracking, while interceptors such as Coyote are used to neutralize targets. The significance lies in the architecture. This is not simply one more air defense battery added to a vulnerable base. It is an attempt to build a layered response in which information and reaction are fused together. That creates a sharp contrast with Iran's own approach. Tehran has invested heavily in drones and missile-based pressure, often leaning on volume, saturation, and unpredictability. The American response is not to match that logic directly, but to absorb it, sort it, and break it apart systematically. Iran tries to generate waves. The United States is trying to learn how to fracture those waves before they can produce decisive effect. If that adaptation succeeds, then a key Iranian tool becomes less disruptive over time. Of course, no such transition is flawless. The transcript notes that some interceptor systems have experienced technical problems during testing, including incidents in which projectiles lost control and caused disruptions inside a base. Those details matter, but not only because they show weakness. They also show experimentation in real time. The United States is testing, adjusting, and improving under pressure. That is often how military systems mature. Imperfectly at first, then faster as live feedback reshapes design and doctrine. In that context, the central issue is no longer just who is more assertive in Hormuz. The deeper issue is whether a strategy rooted in geography and short-term shock can still shape outcomes once war enters an era dominated by networks, data fusion, artificial intelligence, and automated defense. Recent developments in the Indian Ocean suggest that Washington is already broadening the answer. The transcript refers to the interception and control of an oil tanker linked to Iran in waters far from the Gulf. That was not presented as a one-off maritime incident. It was a strategic message. Iranian-linked energy flows are vulnerable not only near Hormuz, but across wider sea lanes. Leaving the Gulf no longer guarantees a more permissive operating environment. That matters because Tehran has long depended on complex shipping arrangements to keep oil moving to international markets. These operations are often associated with what is commonly called a shadow fleet. Vessels can change course abruptly, disable identification systems, or transfer cargo at sea to obscure origin and ownership. A meaningful share of that activity takes place across crowded Asian maritime routes, where enforcement has historically been more diffuse than in the Gulf. But once the United States extends scrutiny and interdiction deeper into the Indian Ocean and toward areas near the Strait of Malacca, the pressure becomes far more severe. This is no longer about stopping a single tanker. It is about weakening confidence in the entire network. And once confidence in that network erodes, the economic logic supporting it begins to erode as well. Again, the strategic contrast is unmistakable. Iran targets choke points to generate immediate disruption. The United States targets the broader flow, the shipping architecture itself, to constrict the system from the roots. One approach creates noise quickly, the other works more slowly, but against the foundations of the opposing economy. And in this wider picture, Asia emerges as a crucial link. That is not because Asian states are necessarily direct participants in the conflict. It is because the region hosts intersecting global trade routes, including maritime spaces where sanctioned oil can potentially be blended into normal commercial flows. Tightening oversight there does not only affect Iran, it has implications for energy, logistics, and supply chains more broadly. This is why the confrontation cannot be understood only as a Middle Eastern crisis. As Washington pushes the contest outward, it is not simply applying military pressure. It is also reshaping how the global energy market functions under stress. In a world where nearly every major economy depends on stable energy transport, the side that can influence those flows holds strategic leverage that reaches well beyond visible military clashes. What happens at sea can alter economic calculations on multiple continents. The same logic appears in Europe, though in a different form. The transcript points to a major military strategy unveiled by Boris Pistorius in Germany, described as one of the most significant overhauls of the German armed forces in decades. The stated aim is not modest. Germany wants to build a force strong enough to become a leading military pillar of Europe in the years ahead. What stands out is not merely higher troop totals or larger budgets. It is the shift in how military effectiveness is being defined. The focus is moving away from simple inventories of tanks or aircraft and toward battlefield effect in modern war. That means long-range precision strike, defense against high-speed threats, resilient command systems, and especially unmanned platforms. Placed in a broader context, this points to a wider Western learning process. From Ukraine to the Middle East, recent conflicts have exposed the growing importance of flexibility, speed, and technological adaptation. Western governments appear to be trying to convert those lessons into doctrine and procurement. That is significant for Iran because Tehran's model relies heavily on regional pressure, deniable networks, and proxy-linked escalation. Those tools can remain dangerous for a long time, but they become harder to exploit strategically if the opposing side is redesigning itself to operate effectively inside disorder. And that may be the most important shift of all. The West is not only trying to restore stability, it is trying to function inside instability without surrendering strategic initiative. That changes the equation. If disorder no longer paralyzes the system, then creating disorder becomes less decisive as a strategy. Iran can still produce turbulence, but turbulence alone may no longer compel the outcomes it wants. The connection between theaters reinforces that conclusion. The Middle East is not being treated as a separate arena anymore. What happens in Hormuz can influence planning in the Indian Ocean, and lessons from Ukraine can be applied to bases in Saudi Arabia. The battle space is becoming interconnected. A move by Iran in one zone can prompt adaptation not only at the point of contact, but in completely different regions. That multiplies the cost of every tactical escalation. Seen from this angle, Iran's approach starts to reveal structural limits. Dramatic acts, from seizing ships to showcasing missile capabilities, can dominate headlines and rattle markets. But media impact is not the same as strategic transformation. If the opposing side is quietly rebuilding the wider architecture of control, then each spectacular move may carry diminishing returns. It may still alarm. It may still raise prices, but it may do less and less to change the long-term direction of the confrontation. This is why the sequence from Hormuz to the Indian Ocean to European rearmament matters. It suggests that the confrontation is evolving into a competition between two different concepts of power. Iran is investing in the capacity to disrupt. The United States, Israel, and a wider Western coalition are investing in the capacity to endure, adapt, and control. That distinction helps explain the apparent contradiction at the center of the crisis. Iran has clearly demonstrated that it can generate shocks large enough to force the world's attention. A few actions in and around Hormuz can move oil prices, trigger maritime alerts, and oblige major powers to respond. That is real power. It should not be dismissed, and it is precisely why Tehran continues to rely on that toolkit. But while Iran concentrates on short-term pressure, Washington and its partners appear to be building long-term control structures. Maritime pressure remains in place. Counter-UAV technology is being deployed and refined. Enforcement is expanding beyond the Middle East. The response is becoming more layered, not less. In parallel, Israel continues to pressure Iranian-aligned forces in other theaters, raising the cost of regional expansion. Europe is preparing for a future in which such threats may become more frequent and more technologically complex. The net effect is cumulative. All of these developments point in one direction. The decisive question is no longer who can produce the greatest immediate tension. The decisive question is who can preserve advantage once tension becomes a normal condition. That is an important distinction. If crisis becomes permanent, then the winner is not the actor that shocks the system most dramatically on a given day. It is the actor that can keep operating, coordinating, and imposing costs over time. Iran may continue to agitate the Strait of Hormuz, but each round of escalation can also accelerate the search for workarounds, alternatives, and protective systems designed to reduce dependence on that choke point. In that sense, the very leverage Iran is using may be pushing others to dilute its future value. The United States and its allies do not necessarily need to control Hormuz in the old-fashioned sense. They may only need to ensure that the global system can adapt when disruption occurs, that shipping can be rerouted, defended, or economically absorbed, and that panic does not automatically translate into strategic concession. That is the core of the wider contest. Iran is trying to preserve its position as a gatekeeper at a strategic passage. The United States and the West are trying to build a world in which that gatekeeper role matters less than it once did. If they succeed, then the leverage Tehran derives from geography will gradually decline. The conflict, in that sense, is not only being fought on the sea, in the air, or at the negotiating table. It is being fought at the level of systems design, alliance structure, and strategic adaptation. When all of these developments are placed in a straight line, a broader reality comes into view. Iran is trying to remain important by proving that it can create enough disruption to demand attention. The United States and its partners are moving toward a different objective entirely. Their aim is not to respond dramatically to every single Iranian move. Their aim is to make those moves progressively less meaningful. That is a profound shift in the logic of the confrontation. In earlier periods, any serious tension in Hormuz could pull the entire world rapidly toward crisis. Now, Washington appears less willing to operate under that older logic. Instead of concentrating everything on one hotspot, it is distributing pressure across multiple layers. Those layers include economic restrictions, maritime enforcement, technological modernization, and tighter alliances. The effect is to absorb and diffuse escalation rather than allow it to cascade unchecked. That does not eliminate danger, but it does change the strategic mechanics of danger. This is what it looks like when a major power shifts from a reactive posture to a more proactive one. It does not need to stop every hostile act in advance. It only needs to ensure that no hostile act can fundamentally alter the outcome. Once that threshold is reached, the indicators of advantage change. The number of missiles launched or ships detained still matters, but less than the capacity to preserve a favorable equilibrium over time. Endurance becomes a weapon in its own right. Iran, meanwhile, appears trapped in an increasingly difficult position. If it continues escalating, it risks provoking stronger responses from the United States and Israel, possibly across multiple theaters. If it reduces pressure, it weakens one of its most visible and effective instruments of coercion. That is a genuine strategic dilemma, and it becomes harder to solve as Western coordination improves. From American integration of new battlefield technologies to Europe's accelerated military planning, Iran is no longer dealing with a single opponent in isolation. It is dealing with an ecosystem of power. That ecosystem can share data, adapt quickly, and coordinate across separate regions. Such a structure does not remove friction or disagreement among allies, but it does create depth and resilience that a disruption-based strategy finds difficult to break. This is why the confrontation between the United States and Iran now looks larger than a bilateral dispute. It is becoming a test between two models of power. One model leans on disruption, on choke points, and on sudden strategic shock. The other leans on systems, control, layered defense, distributed enforcement, and the ability to maintain order inside turbulence. When those two models meet directly, time becomes a decisive factor. Shock tactics can be effective today. They can unsettle markets, dominate attention, and impose immediate costs. But durable systems are what shape tomorrow. That is why the dramatic images of ship seizures in Hormuz, however striking, may not fully reflect the real balance of the conflict behind those visible incidents. A deeper restructuring is taking place. That restructuring is quieter, more complex, and likely more consequential for the region over the coming years. It involves military doctrine, shipping enforcement, alliance behavior, defense technology, and the political will to normalize operation under persistent risk. None of that means the danger is overstated. The danger is real. A single miscalculation in the Strait of Hormuz could still trigger a broader crisis, especially where energy supplies, naval forces, and political signaling intersect so tightly. But the strategic meaning of each confrontation is changing. An incident that once might have dictated the entire agenda now enters a larger matrix of pressure and response. That larger matrix favors the side that can adapt fastest and sustain. Pressure longest. So the story here is not simply whether Iran can cause disruption. It plainly can. The story is whether disruption remains enough when the opposing side is redesigning the environment in which disruption occurs, that is the real contest now taking shape. Not just over one strait, one tanker, or one exchange of threats, but over the future rules of coercion, deterrence, and military relevance in the 21st century. Iran is trying to prove that geography still confers decisive leverage. The United States and its allies are trying to prove that integrated systems can outlast and outmaneuver geographic blackmail. Each new development, from maritime seizures to counter-drone deployments, fits into that larger argument, and for now, that argument remains unresolved. Iran can still make the region tremble. The United States and its partners are trying to ensure that trembling no longer translates into strategic control. That is why this confrontation remains so important. It is not only about the present crisis, it is about whether the future of conflict will belong to actors that can create disruption or to actors that can absorb it, manage it, and ultimately reduce its value. The answer is still unfolding, but one thing is already clear. This is no longer a narrow regional standoff. It is a broader struggle over who sets the tempo, who writes the rules, and whose model of power will matter most when. Instability is no longer the exception, but the norm.